Hello everyone, and how's it going? This video idea just sort of popped into my head recently. Sort of a combination of some of the things that I care about most, history and EU4. As you guys know previously, I've made a video where I basically rehashed a presentation I gave on the sort of like historical theory behind a lot of EU4's kind of decisions and also like problematic parts of EU4's decisions and the way they sort of misrepresent history according to kind of consensus historiography in, academia at least. Recently, I listened to the Three Moves Ahead podcast episode, Patreon only. It's a podcast about strategy games, and they sort of hashed out the details of what we know so far about EU5, Europa Universalis 5, which has not been named yet, but everyone sort of knows that that's what Project Caesar is, which is what Paradox has been posting about a lot on the forums and different sort of like pre-dev diaries. I'm actually not reading anything like that. I'm not reading the sort of dev diaries or write-ups that they're doing about this Project Caesar, in part because I don't like getting too into a game and its development and like expectations before it comes out. I want to sort of be able to go into EU5 blind. But if you haven't heard, Europa Universalis 5 is basically confirmed. It's basically confirmed to be starting in 1337 rather than 1444, a lot earlier, a whole other 100 years plus of basically late medieval Europe, or late medieval world. And it occurred to me this would be a great sort of opportunity to talk about what I, as a historian, practicing historian, really want to see out of EU5, Europa Universalis 5. What sort of characteristics I know are present in EU4 that after 1,350 hours that I have, which I know is not that much compared to some other players, I really feel like the 5th edition of Europa Universalis could really improve on its representation of history with. This may just be a part 1 of many video. I'm sure people will have other ideas about things. I am a historian and I've studied a lot of different parts of history, but I am by no means a expert on every single region, time period, approach, regardless, you name it. But I am a generalist, and I do like talking about history as a whole, particularly in the early modern period, and not just sort of confining myself to one country or one kingdom or one region of the world. As you may be able to tell from my sweater, I studied international history at the London School of Economics. But enough about me. I'd like to talk about this video is mainly about Europa Universalis 5. And so I basically just like to go through a sort of list that I put together about some of my ideas of what I would really like to see in EU5 as a historian, as someone who really thinks that Europa Universalis is an incredible teaching tool for myself and for others about early modern history, late medieval history, modern history, however you want to bound it. So number 1 is colonizable provinces. That's a big issue in this game. And generally the colonial system, but specifically my focus always sort of goes to colonizable provinces. I talked about this in my video on the sort of historical representation and historiography of EU4. I'll link that below. But really my main point here is that it's really weird and in most cases quite arbitrary which provinces in the Americas, in Southeast Asia, Indonesia area, in Africa are determined to be just colonial provinces that have no kind of state already in them by the time the European colonizers come around. Relative to a neighbor might be in West Africa or North America or what have you, has a state. So why for example is the Native American polity in one province around Massachusetts, why are they labeled with a state, but the guys next to them in Rhode Island or something, it's just an empty province with some unnamed natives who you just have to put down, basically. That's like their only function. I think this is arbitrary. I think it is sort of dehumanizing to the sort of arbitrarily determining, these people count as kind of being human enough, being sort of civilized enough to have a state. These people don't. What I'd rather see, I don't want to see fewer people have states. I'd rather see basically more, if not all provinces have, if not state is not always the right word for it, but a polity representation at some point in all these colonizable provinces. I understand that would make it more difficult perhaps to, keep around the current colonial mechanics, because the current colonial mechanics require you to basically have empty provinces. But so much of colonialism from the very beginning, from Vasco da Gama's first trip to West India, I think it was West India where he landed, Calicut. Obviously they didn't found a colony on that trip, but a lot of colonialism was diplomacy with the native peoples who the Europeans were finding. I'm not saying this was like, shaking hands and everyone smiling diplomacy. Maybe people were smiling, but oftentimes it was fake. There was a lot of cruelty and manipulation and whatever. But regardless, I don't think that colonialism should simply be finding a functionally empty province and sending a settler there and just sort of leaving it. I just think that it just doesn't make any sense. And it just looks silly to kind of be showing up in, the Philippines, Indonesia, Southwest Pacific area, and having some provinces already be owned by states, but other ones just supposedly being empty. And particularly, for me, almost every time that I play a colonial game, I go with the least aggressive native option, the native policy, the native coexistence policy. And obviously it's sort of absurd to just be able to send a settler or colonist to an empty province and not have to engage with the people who live there at all. I mean, I guess, maybe it's abstracted and that's sort of happening on the ground, but it's just weird. And it's weird that in history, when colonists showed up to a place where people already lived, there was definitionally interaction, and that wasn't always bad. I mean, sometimes one side helped the other and, it was mutually beneficial. I'm not saying that was, the rule. Oftentimes it was bad, but for a game that's all about the nitty-gritty of history, while I understand that they have to make certain sacrifices in order to still be able to make a playable video game, it just seems very sort of intellectually lazy and just not, interesting, and really, in many cases, downright sort of offensive, to really just have all of these these territories just be sort of empty, with the occasional, every year, every couple of years, you get this just sort of nameless, faceless native uprising that, all you need is, one regiment or whatever. I mean, that from a numbers perspective, maybe that makes sense, in terms of how many European gun-wielding colonists or, armies it took to fight against a larger group of natives. But regardless, in a game all about polities and geopolitics, it's just weird for certain entities, and we don't really know why, and we don't really have, we don't know why the developers made these decisions. It's just weird for certain entities to just sort of be relegated to this dustbin of history where they just don't get anything more than just sort of being a part of the empty province that you find. And speaking of underrepresented groups, not really related to colonial empire in the same way, but particularly given that EU5 is probably going to be starting in the early to mid 1300s. At that point in Europe, which again, this game centers on Europe, I know you can play the whole world, and that the rest of the world is also super important, but a lot of what I know about is European history. And in 1337, or thereabouts, a lot of Europe was still pagan, quote unquote, non-Christian. The entire state of Lithuania, as a lot of people know, was a pagan state. It was not sort of formally, fully converted to Christianity until 1376, 1378, but even then, that was still just a top level. The crown converted to Christianity, but on a province level, there were still many, if not the large majority of people practicing non-Christian beliefs. And even in EU4's time, 1444, I mean, it probably would have been more accurate to represent certain provinces as being pagan. But 1337 is you can't not do that. As well as territories in the Eastern Baltic, and I'm sure there were maybe provinces in Scandinavia that still had maybe majority pagan practicing. And not to mention the sort of apostasy or syncretism where, people would practice Christianity in public, but then practice paganism at home. And maybe that doesn't, I don't know how you'd represent that in the game, but regardless. I don't know how complicated this sort of solution that I'm proposing has to be. I just think that given how much paganism there was in Europe at that time, particularly Northeast Europe, I sincerely just hope that is represented accurately in this game, and it's not just sort of washed over, and most countries over there are called Christian just sort of to make the gameplay simpler, because I actually think that it would be more interesting to be able to engage with that very important Christianity versus capital O other conflict happening, being led largely by the Teutonic Order and the Livonian Order in the Baltic, northeastern Europe at that time. And related to religion and statecraft and whatever, at least in Europe at that time, again, this is a Europe focus, the concept of the nation state did not exist in 1444. It 10 times as much did not exist in 1337. I mean, arguably in 1444 you could, some people would say you could begin to trace the sort of origins of national power consolidation to, maybe emerge with the post-Westphalian nation system after the 30 Years' War in the early to mid 1600s. But 1337, early to mid 1300s, still very much finds Europe, at least, in a very decentralized, non-consolidated form. The only concept of the nation that had ever existed, natio, was a religious one, a Catholic one. Basically these different regions of Christianity that were very malleable and were sort of divided between, there was the Iberian Peninsula was one, and France was one, and Germany was one, and the sort of Slavic, Polish, Catholic area was another one. But it was Germany and Scandinavia and a bunch of different areas in Eastern Europe, and England either wasn't in there or it was thrown in with France or the Germanic nation or something. And assuming that the game is still going to end around approximately, give or take even 50 years, the same time that EU4 does in 1821, I can't even begin to imagine how they're going to create one engine, one system to represent the ways that states were organized in the early to mid 1300s, and also the way that states were organized in approximately 1800. If you think about 1300s Europe, it's, your overlord is as much the Pope, at least in many sort of non-physical ways, as it is your king or your duke or whatever. And of course, your king or your duke may be hundreds of miles away and have functionally no authority over you. Again, relating to Europe, before we sort of move out to the broader globe, there are a couple of things that I'm particularly interested in seeing as someone who studied a lot of Northern European history, particularly 1300s through 1500s. The first is that, again, in EU4, 1444 finds the Hansa, the Hanseatic League, it's still, if not in its golden age, it's still at the relative height of its power. It doesn't sort of really begin to fade noticeably for another 50, 75 years. But in EU4, of course, the Hansa basically is a non-entity, other than there's that one event in the HRE, whether you want to support the Hansa or not. And in the 1300s and the 1400s, but really the 1300s particularly, really during the golden age of the Hanseatic League, the Hansa members really successfully had removed themselves from the authority of the emperor. I mean, they were sort of on the other side of Germany, and they had no interest in reporting to the emperor. They basically had, it was a very informal organizational structure that the Hansa had. They rarely, if ever, met, and there wasn't a lot of sort of trans-regional coordination. But this was a big deal in Northern Europe and Europe at the time. I mean, it really rivaled and preceded the sort of Italian commercial empires of the Renaissance. And I really hope that there's some sort of Hanseatic structure allowed in this game. Now, of course, in real life, the Hansa never became that formalized. But, as a Hansa enthusiast, but I think a lot of people are really interested in this kind of thing, I think that it would be actually really cool to have a vaguely Holy Roman Empire sort of structure or path that you can take as a Hansa member. Maybe you could try to consolidate it in a way that it never had been in real life. Alt history, that's the fun part about EU4. That's, forming the Holy Roman Empire has never happened in real life as a sort of consolidated state, but that's a satisfying thing to do, tag switch in EU4. But anything, even, I can imagine even a scenario as Lübeck, where you consolidate the power a little bit so that maybe every Hansa member is a vassal or sort of has a tributary style system, and maybe you get if you sort of stay on top of things and don't fail in the way that the Hansa did in the 1500s, you should be able to have some sort of privileged access to the courts of, say England and Norway and maybe some other, Novgorod, but that didn't last as long. And this is, what I'm about to discuss is something that relates to Europe. It relates to the entire world. I know more about Europe in this period, at least around this, than I do around the rest of the world. That standing armies didn't exist in this period. And it's not just they didn't exist in this period. They didn't exist for hundreds of years after this, really, as a concept, other than in specific places like maybe China, almost certainly China at that point, maybe the Ottoman Empire in the 1400s. There was no national army that was sort of living off the king's coin and their barracks, when there weren't wars. That just, there weren't the resources and manpower available for that kind of thing. Nor perhaps most importantly, the kind of political coordination internally within a country. It just wasn't something that was particularly of interest to leaders. And we know this from Crusader kings, that you don't have an army as the state until you levy the army, and then you get to use it for a while, but it's sort of a hassle, and it involves basically negotiating with your vassals and your decentralized polity to get what is really their troops, which of course they also have to levy from their vassals, and so on and so forth. And I think this is actually, in EU4, this is also, I think this could fix one of EU4's problems, which is that EU4 is all about military conquest, but it gets a little boring and simplistic, because it's really just, EU4 is, as I often say to people, particularly people who haven't experienced EU4 a lot, but also my friends who have played it hundreds and hundreds of hours, is that EU4 is a very simple game disguised behind the veneer of a very complex game. As we all know, there are all these systems and graphs and measurements and everything in EU4 that a lot of us don't even understand. I still don't understand the trade system really at all. I couldn't tell you what the difference that much of what the difference is between morale and discipline and infantry combat ability and all these other military modifiers. But at the end of the day, we all sort of know how to just make line go up in EU4 and get bigger armies and conquer more territory, and you can let the sort of complexity fall away, which is fine. That's not a bad thing. It sort of gives you the option of engaging with the complexity if you want, as I know a lot of people do, but it also lets you kind of simplify it if you're not super into the graphs and absolute micromanaging of military things, which I'm not really. And I'd love to see the military idea in this game really be represented more accurately, which is trying to get troops and manage your armies and keep them fighting, and keep them fighting on the front lines is about as hard as actually winning battles and everything. And this is logistics totally changed in the late 19th century with the invention of canned food and military medicine and things. All of a sudden armies could campaign much, much farther away. But this was, a lot of historians are in agreement that the Ottoman Empire really found its limits kind of at the gates of Vienna, and the other limits that it found in North Africa and Iraq area. It found those limits because beyond that, it could no longer, the empire could no longer really effectively and consistently create the logistics supply that it needed in order to maintain control over those far-flung provinces. And the Ottoman Empire is not the only empire that struggles with this. Every empire does. Getting troops is hard. Keeping troops on the battlefield is hard. Keeping control of them is hard without a standing army, which didn't really exist for hundreds of years after this. And, as we know in the modern world, sometimes it's still hard to control your troops when they're thousands of miles away from home. And this connects us to a broader thing that includes army levies and the lack of standing armies and sort of development of standing armies, which is that this is a common criticism of EU4, that there's not a lot of sort of internal management in the game. It's really, the game only really rewards you for snowballing, and it's fine. I like EU4 more than Crusader Kings. I'm not really a Crusader Kings person. The character focus, there's something about it that just doesn't do it for me. I like EU4's sort of focus on the state as an actor, as the primary actor, the primary building block of the world. I think that's more, that just resonates with me and is more interesting to me than Crusader King's sort of character-focused thing. And that's not objective, it's just what I'm interested in. But as the state in EU4, you're not really engaging with yourself a whole lot, more than just recruiting advisors and putting down rebels and developing your provinces. And the military situation is a good example of this, that it takes a lot of internal state administration and finagling and internal diplomacy with your vassals and with your states and so on, to have a standing army. But that's not really, not even a standing, to levy an army at all, but that's not represented in EU4 more beyond just you need the ducats and the manpower. But administrating a state also is there's a lot more to it than just armies as well. You think of the estate mechanics in EU4, which people often complain about. It's just the estates, which are really incredibly important in this period of history, sort of as in this middle way between really decentralized power and national consolidation, the absolutism style politics that we associate with later early modern period. you have to manage your estates in late medieval and early modern Europe. You have to manage basically your special interest groups that often have a lot more money than you do, often have a lot more social and political clout than you do, and often have a much larger army than you do. And that didn't go away in the 1400s. It certainly didn't go away in the 1300s. It didn't even really go away in the 1500s. I mean, you only really see that begin to change in like the 1800s, maybe 1700s for specific countries. And EU4 doesn't have to be Crusader Kings or the Victoria series. You don't have to, like, it doesn't have to be a game about managing your tax collection and your production facilities and every little minute relationship within your governmental hierarchy and your court and your estates and so on. But I also don't want it to be a game just about sort of this like absolutely consolidated nation state, which EU4 really is about, with the exception of, vassalage, people who start off with vassals, which are still reasonably few. I mean, France. And I'd much rather there be a little bit more micromanaging in terms of your national economy and politics and internal diplomacy. And you don't necessarily even need a big character system for this. I just, what I want both as a historian and also as a person who plays these games for fun is I want something to do that's not just make a bigger army and go to war. I want to manage my, nobility and burghers and sort of engage with, for example, the burghers' trade practices, whether it's the Hansa or the English merchant adventurers or the mercantile community that emerged out of the Low Countries in this period, or Spain, or Italy, or whatever. Managing the nobility's kind of political goals, and particularly in the 1300s, but of course continuing on much later, managing the clergy and clerical relationship with the Pope, who is really sort of everyone's emperor in a certain way. It's funny. It's funny to me that in a game that has so much success representing in a fun and engaging way the early modern period, it really glosses over one of the very most important socio-political, geopolitical dynamic changes in this moment, which was national consolidation. The consolidation of power under one ruler or, one cabinet. The player doesn't actually get to engage with that much, other than, some events that pop up on your screen where you click one button or the other, or, you annex your vassals. Which again, annexing your vassals, it's not complicated. You just wait, you start off as France, you just wait 10 years and you annex them. The only person for whom it's really difficult is the Timurids, which, makes sense because the Timurids fell in 1444, right after 1444, and, it should be difficult for them to manage their subordinates. But it should also be difficult for France or Spain or England to manage their sort of sub-polities within the state. And I really think as the player, you should be able to take part in, if you want, or even, take it in a different direction, this sort of preeminent moment in history where the state goes from this thing that is really far away and doesn't have a lot of power. There should just be a lot more push and pull between you as the government that is attempting to centralize power, all power under its own authority. A lot more push and pull between that and all the other interests in your country who you have nominal rulership over, who really don't actually want to submit to you. And I imagine that as the player, it would be quite satisfying to have that triumph. And that's a triumph not over enemies beyond your borders, but over your own state, it's like a personal triumph. And that is just historically more accurate and more interesting. And also just, I think from a gameplay perspective, more interesting, which sort of connects to my last thing, which is that EU4 it's about alt history, and that's why it's fun. If you were just on rails and you couldn't do anything really outside of what actually happened in history, it's not really a game, right? But it's also not really fun, and it sort of ruins the suspension of disbelief when you have a game that is supposed to be about basically taking control of history, and there's no real resistance to just infinitely enlarging yourself, particularly after a specific point. Empires across history, it's not like, Civilization, where you're just supposed to, the game, Sid Meier's Civilization, where you just get bigger and bigger and stronger the entire time. Empires rise and then they fall, and sometimes an empire that covered half the world, or, half of Eurasia or whatever, one century, the next century is, defined by a couple provinces somewhere, and otherwise no longer exists, except in the sort of cultural memory and political memory of the people who once were under that empire. And this is decently well represented in EU4 in terms of the way the AI play, Because, you know, sometimes if you, not always, but sometimes, you know, often when you're playing in EU4, you'll see, you know, one country will get really big and then they'll sort of overextend themselves, and then they'll get a lot of rebels, or they'll fall apart to a larger, like a, you know, a coalition or something. Think of, like, you know, Ming Explosion, for example, the collapse of the Ming Empire. But I've also seen, you know, like big colonial wars between Spain and France or something, where one of them is really the greatest power, but then the other one, you know, with maybe a couple of allies, one AI brings, you know, the big power down. But as the player, anyone who is half decent at EU4, by the time you get to a sort of middle to upper middle power level, there's really no going down again. It's all just Whig history, line go up, country get bigger. There's not resistance. There's no push down from the top, as there obviously is in real life, to just infinitely getting better and stronger. And that is historically uninteresting and inaccurate, but it's also from a gameplay perspective uninteresting, because EU4, there's just this inevitable point in EU4 where you get to this point where there's not a lot to do other than just sort of click the buttons and expand. And at that point, it just gets sort of boring. And this is really my biggest issue with EU4. And, you know, we've all experienced this, you know, getting bored of a game after 1600 or thereabouts. Because, like, who wants to spend another 20 hours or whatever half of an EU4 campaign is, 15, 10, I don't know, just clicking the same buttons and just expanding with no sort of rules or limits to constrain you? Because then it's just like, there's no resistance. It's not a game. You might as well just not play it. And this is where Crusader Kings succeeds, and why it has such a big following is because Crusader Kings, part of your own story is losing. Part of the fun is losing. The fun games in Crusader Kings are as often when you lose as when you win. You rise, and then something just totally absurd happens, your dynasty falls apart, you're invaded, whatever. That's how history works. You know, some of us don't like it, but it is. And if you can combine that with more detailed internal management of your own country, then the problem with EU4 is that there is no real internal management game. So there's not fun things to do in EU4 if you're not expanding or sort of diplomatically finagling to expand. And if you could combine the sort of natural rise and fall, and maybe rise again, of countries, of states, with internal management, more details and more fun there, then you could really have a more interesting game on a very fundamental level. A game where you really feel like you're role-playing history throughout the entire thing, not just until 1550 or 1600 or wherever, at whatever point that you just sort of get to the point where you can steamroll over everyone else. Because if you think about it, there are so many empires that sort of emerged in the beginning of the Europa Universalis timeline, particularly EU4 starting in 1444. I mean, I think of the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Mughals, the Qing Empire, not in 1444, but 150 years later-ish, 200 years later, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands. So many empires. They weren't necessarily empires in 1444, but they rose to imperial sort of world domination in their own ways during this period. And by the end of the game, by 1821, most of them were sort of on their way out. I mean, you think of Spain, Netherlands. The Safavids didn't even really exist anymore in 1821, as far as I can remember. Arguably, no, with empires like the Ottomans or the Qing, they still had some juice left in them, and it wasn't necessarily inevitable that they were going to fall 100 years later. But imagine a game where it is just as fun to see your empire slowly crumble and the world change around you as it is to have that initial rush of expansion. And I know that's hard, and I know that I don't have any detailed, specific suggestions off the top of my head about how to make that work. But at least have that tension of like, oh my god, my empire could fall. You know, the world's changing around me. Military technology, administrative technology is changing. I may be advanced in 4 different really important practices, but I'm falling behind in this one that, you know, France and England have over me, or Japan has over me, or something. And you got to catch up as the player. That gives you a goal even in late game. And I know it's not fun necessarily to have spent hours and hours working towards success in the early to mid game only to have the game sort of arbitrarily take it away from you. It can't be arbitrary. It can't be like arbitrary imposition of like, you know, oh yeah, you can't expand anymore. But if there was more internal management, more dealing with your disloyal factions within your estates, within your country, within your court, if there was more sort of like, even if everyone was vaguely on the same tech level, maybe there were some advances and your neighbor made some advances in gunpowder or something that just, you can't stand up to their armies. And you have to figure out how to do something about that. Or, your neighbor or a nearby power made some advances in, commercial mechanisms. I can think of a million sort of general examples off the top of my head. The Ottomans eventually lost a lot of their imperial power because they didn't advance their naval technology like the Portuguese and the Spanish and the English did, and they were basically trying to hold on to power in the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean with galleys that couldn't stand up to ocean-ready gunboats. And so how would you, as the Ottomans, deal with this and push against this resistance and, maybe still triumph in the end, maybe not, but at least there's a game there. At least it's not just sort of throwing your larger armies at other people and just taking their provinces, and there's nothing more to it than that. I have a lot more things on my list, but this video has already been super long and meandering, so I'm going to leave it here. Some other ideas that I had, for example, is personal interest, I really want to have a formable Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam, the whole, sort of reuniting the original Islamic empire that emerged in the first few decades. There's a serious problem with the concept of the horde. For people who actually study history, there's no such thing as a horde. I mean, it's like the way that there are certainly nomadic peoples, but the horde and this idea of this sort of ungoverned mass, this wave that flows across the Eurasian steppe, for example, is fantasy, and I think there should be more explored there. But regardless, yes. So this has been basically discussions of as much my problems with the representation of history in EU4 as it is sort of hopes for EU5. But I hope you could see sort of one and the other and the other in the first one. And EU5 just has so much to work with. And EU4 is already such an amazing game for someone who's interested in history, for someone who studies history, for someone who wants to teach history. The thing about EU4 is that it just has so much to work with. And it's such a good game, and I don't know. I have so many problems with it, and I have so much love for it. It's just, EU4 is kind of like life. Like, you love it and hate it at the same time. But I definitely have high hopes for it, and I know that, Paradox sequels tend to generate a lot of high hope, particularly over the last 10 to 15 years. And Paradox certainly has a lot to deliver to exceed on EU4, and they've had mixed success with the previous releases the previous sequels that they've had over the last few years. But yeah, I might make another one of these. I might start making more videos, different videos about EU5, currently called Project Caesar. Still trying to go in, relatively blind for whenever it comes out later this year, maybe? I'm not sure. But regardless, I'm excited. And I'm excited to be able to play through more of medieval history in the Europa Universalis sort of gameplay style way of doing things. Thank you all very much for watching. I really appreciate it. I like talking about this. It's been a while since I made a video, but I had a lot of fun. And I always have a lot of fun talking about history in EU4 Paradox games, strategy games generally. Look forward to seeing you all in the next video. Bye.